much of our lives inside, either in traffic at work or close eyes. How about we all agree that it's way overdue to take back our lives? I can work wherever now. You can work wherever now. Take your guard and let it down, 'cause you can work wherever now. Take your guard and let it down, 'cause you can work wherever now.
What's up, guys, and welcome into the Work Wherever podcast. This is the podcast where we go over automation, technology, the ability to work wherever, and where we learn to live every day like it is Saturday. Thanks for joining me. I'm Roy Edwards. Can't remember if I said that or not. Sometimes I just speak and kind of forget what I say sometimes. So today we are not going over my amnesia, but we're going over automation. And so a lot of companies now are looking at automation as a way to replace people, which is a super dangerous way to go about automation. And the other way that is dangerous that people are going over automation is they're going through it and they're looking at it as if they already understand the process. And they're just winging it, right? Also, super dangerous way to go about automation. And so how do you go about automation would be your natural next question, right? And so what we're going to look at is, and the way that I've always kind of approached DevOps, DevSecOps, which DevOps is development and operations teams together. It's a philosophy of security and operations together running your team. They are all communicating together. So you have this communication where you used to have development operations teams separate, and then your security team was a separate team, right? And so you had three different teams, and as you could probably imagine, the more teams and the more things that you're trying to get done, the more teams that you have, the more avenues for potential miscommunication you have. So the theories and philosophies of DevOps and DevSecOps was to bring these teams together as essentially one team to avoid any, that's not my role, that's not what I do type of things, throwing it over the fence, which prolonged development, which actually comes from war strategy. So when you had multiple different areas of war, platoons or battalions or areas that do different things, you should be brought together under a single mission so that everybody understands what it is ultimately that we're trying to accomplish and go about it that way. And so the more, since I've always looked at it as terms of war, so I've studied, I'm a history minor, right? So I love history. I'm a history buff. And I've always approached running a business, automation and development from a historical point of view. I like to look at historical people, how they solved big problems, and then see if I can use that in the kind of like format into business and automation and technology, which kind of like, I was actually talking to a buddy the other day about this to say, I'm equating and I'm taking these things from historical figures and war generals, and then applying them to automation and, as a way to articulate a very complicated thing, or what can be seen as a very complicated thing in automation, which stems from, people don't like to talk about things that they don't understand because they don't like to make it seem like that they're not smart, right? Nobody likes to feel like an idiot. Right? So the natural thing is to just get out of the conversation. Oh man, that sounds crazy. And, I'm going to leave. I'm going to back away from this conversation because I don't want to be made seem like I'm an idiot, which is a bad way to go about things, but it's a natural reaction, right? People don't like to talk about things they don't know about because they don't want to make it seem like they're an idiot. So whenever I'm talking to people and I'm like, they're like, what do you do? And I used to say, I do robotic process automation. And people will be like, oh, cool. And then generally that's where the conversation ends because people don't know what that means. And then I was like, all right, well, I'd build collaborative intelligence. Collaborative intelligence, people are like, I've had people who are in the software field be like, what? Or I had to Google that, kinds of things, right? So that got me thinking, like, how can I articulate this in a way that people understand? And that led me to history. And I was talking to a buddy the other day, and I was telling him about this, and he was like, that's the kind of like theory, which I guess Bronson does. I was like, all right, cool. Kind of like, all right, I'm going to liberate that, start using that, kind of like. So automation is kind of like war and the art of war and tactics around historical war. And so we're going to go over today is the first stage of automation and how to plan automation, because that's what you first need is a plan. There's multiple steps and multiple stages to automation, but we're going to focus on the very first step, which is plan. The other stages that we'll break down are design, make, test, deploy, and refine. But today's episode is going to be around planning and how it equates to war. So first off, in planning for automation, you want to identify the 4 W's. And for those of you who don't know what the 4 W's are, they are who, what, when, and why. Some people throw the how in there, but how is automation? So let your development team figure that one out, right? The H is for your development team and your design team. And capital presence if you want to, let us figure out the how, right? If you don't want to do it in-house. But before you contact a developer or even talk to a development team, you want to make sure that you are getting into the 4 W's. The who, what, when, and why. That's right. Good job. Good job, class. So the four W's are extremely important to understanding automation, which is your end game and end goal. And before you do that, before you get to the how or looking into tools or buying software or doing any of that stuff, you need to understand the 4 W's. That should be your first step, because if you try to do anything else, the just wing it approach, you're going to end up in trouble. And so I started looking at some of the famous war generals, and one of the ones that I came across was Napoleon. Napoleon was a very famous French, I guess he was a general, or he ultimately became I believe he was like the president or the emperor or the, he was head of France. And so he is he's known as like a brilliant military mind, and he was at war with essentially the world, really, but much of Europe, and he tried to invade in Russia at one point. And so between, I believe it was, I don't have the years written down, but between 1802, I believe, and 1813, he was essentially at war with the entire Eastern world. Right, so if the United States is the West, Europe, and into Eastern Europe, he was at war, trying to establish France and trying to build France into this, which he ultimately did, build it into a powerhouse. And so he had established the French power influence all the way across Europe, and he decided that he wanted to bring Russia into his fold. He wanted to bring Russia into this, and he was actually going to attack Russia. And so before this, the campaign, which I believe it's called the Russian campaign, it took place in June of 1812. And so by this time, if you remember the dates that I gave you, or the years of 1802 to 1813, I believe was the kind of the wars of Napoleon. We're already well into that, right? We're close to the end here. And so in 1812, he was like, I'm going to go to the Russian campaign. And so he had, at this point in time, he had between 450 and 600,000 French soldiers, depending on sources and who you ask, who were part of this campaign. And so this campaign began in June of 1812, which, if you're in America, June sounds like summer, but there were there was some elements that he had to deal with, weather included here. And so of the 450,000 to 600,000, let's call it 500,000 soldiers just to cut the middle, about 10,000 of it made it home, and it lasted about 6 months. So it was seen as a huge failure, and his reputation as a military genius was essentially shattered. People began to question Napoleon, and European allies withdrew their support of him, and his goal for bringing Russia into the fold in the French army was it was depleted. And the French dominance of Europe was drastically weakened, to say the least. So France had this, hold on Europe, where they were seen as a military powerhouse, and people were willing to get behind them. And but this approach to tackling Russia, which was relatively unknown at the time, failed. And so why did it fail? That's the question that we want to understand, because up until this, Napoleon had innovated the art of war. He had, a lot of what he had done is used into technology these days. As to what he did, what he was doing right, we see a lot of tech companies, startups, start to take those tactics, and that's where we get a lot of the practices of DevOps. It's not derived directly from Napoleon, but when you look at it and you take and you study his war tactics and how he innovated it, you see those same tactics into DevOps, into technology. And so let's take a look at why he lost, and then we'll talk about why he was seen as a great military mind. But he lost, and he failed to conquer Russia in 1812 for several reasons, but let's break them down. The first one was faulty logistics. So he didn't fully understand what he was getting into in terms of how he was going to spread out his resources, how he was going to tackle things, and the logistics of it were faulty. Second was poor discipline, which is kind of odd when you think about Napoleon, because up until this state, up until the 1812 Russian campaign, he was seen as having a military force that was well aware of what the mission was, and while they weren't the most disciplined military unit, they always knew what they were fighting for, and they were very strategical in how they approached things. So having poor discipline at this point and stage of Napoleon was a bit odd. Next would be disease. It did come in and wipe out a lot of it, which, is something that you can account for sometimes, but, sometimes disease it does things, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. And then the last one would be the weather. And so there were weather that, attributed to disease and some other aspects. So let's take a look at that and break it down into text. So why he lost: logistics, poor discipline and processes, disease, which could be external forces and viruses, and then the weather, which would be environment. He failed to account for the environment. And so Napoleon's method of warfare was based on a rapid concentration of his forces at a key place to destroy the enemy. That was his thought process, which up until this point of 1812, he took an opposite approach, where he attacked things from multiple different angles, and he had a very innovative approach. Whereas in this approach, he tried to just get everybody together and kind of brute force. And he had this a winging it approach. And so in this, you'll see some people who said, like, there are movies and shows that have kind of poked fun at Napoleon's approach, where they say it was a let's show up and see what happens approach. We haven't so many people, we're just going to go in there and we're going to overpower them. No real plan. Where up until this point, you could say that he was one of the most innovative war generals of all time. So Napoleon's background was he was an artillery, an artillerist, I guess is the way that you would say it. But he his background was in artillery, and so up until this point, what made him such a promising and loved and somebody who that militaries generals have since modeled was that he stuck to and he focused on his strengths. And his strengths were in artillery. He understood it. And so he innovated ways to spread out his ammunition. So he didn't I believe he had a shortage in military weapons, so guns. So he had 3 guns for every 100 or 1,000 soldiers. And what he did instead was he figured out a way to overcome that through his knowledge of artillery. That's what made him so good, was he understood what needed to become accomplished. He understood the mission and he stuck to his strengths and he expanded on his strengths and he built plans around his strengths, which were artillery. And so where Napoleon did innovate was in the firepower of his guns. And so rather than dispersing them among the infantry and saying, hey, we don't have enough guns to go around, he got innovative. He dug in and he said, what can we do? I understand this very, very well. This is my strength, and I'm going to play to it. And it ended up becoming a massive part of what made him so successful. And so when faced with superior numbers, because when he was first starting out, when Napoleon was first starting out, he was going against far superior numbers. He didn't have the 450 to 600 military members. He was on the other end of that, defeating armies like that. And so when he was faced with superior numbers, he would divide the enemy army, divide out his military, and make it seem, and he would go in these odd patterns to divide the army that was the enemy, because the enemy army at the time, it was very much I'm going to overpower you, much like Napoleon when he failed. It was a show up and see what happens. We have the numbers. And so he would divide that. So the enemy would say, oh, they're coming in from the east. Oh, they're coming in from the west. And so they would start to try and plan to try to get people in place to account for what seemed like they were coming in from one direction, when really he was coming in from all directions and splitting up the enemy. And since the enemy relied on brute force numbers, then he was able to divide and conquer the enemy. And so he got away from that. And so where he was strategically planning prior to and focusing on his strengths, because he became so built up on his own military knowledge, he forgot that innovating was key. And instead he relied on, we got so many numbers, let's just go into Russia. Let's attack Russia. When he really didn't understand the logistics, the environment. He didn't understand what diseases or viruses might be as part of this environment. And he didn't focus on his strengths. He just winged it, right? Where he was going about this in a way that he had no discipline. Show up and see what happens. And so what we can learn from Napoleon is that when you show up and wing it, no matter how good you think you are, no matter how much you've innovated in the past, if you get away from your strengths and you are no longer focusing in on your strengths, you are going to enter areas of unknown that are going to bring about logistical concerns and lack of discipline. And when you have faulty logistics and poor discipline, that opens up the door for attacks, disease, and environmental unknowns. no matter where you're at. If you're at war, then it opens up to a disease that you weren't ready for, because people are eating things they don't know that they can eat. They're going places they don't know where they can go. There's a new environment. There's all kinds of things that can invite in disease that you weren't accounting for. But in a technical state, so let's equate this now to a technical environment. If you have faulty logistics and you have poor discipline, members are going to start clicking on things, doing things they don't know what they're doing. They're going to go apart and they're going to enter into this unknown. And then that opens up the door for a cyber attack, for malware, for some sort of disease to enter into your environment. That's going to halt your production and halt your systems and potentially lock up your whole enterprise. I mean, that it doesn't take much Googling or understanding to know that people are out there trying to maliciously shut down your servers and hold it for Bitcoin. I mean, that's a real thing. Ransomware is a big deal. The other part of that is the weather. He didn't understand the weather. This was a whole different side of Europe, whole different side of the globe. And so in bringing in, he didn't really truly understand this environment. And if you truly don't understand the environment that you're about to try and move your business into, you're trying to move into automation, you're trying to move into this new, shiny new toy. If you're trying to do it and you don't understand the environment, that is going to play a major role into why you fail. Now, you could say that Napoleon didn't fail because of the environment. You could say that he didn't fail because of disease. You could say he didn't fail because of poor discipline, because when he was doing the other things, he didn't exactly have great discipline either. And you could say that he didn't fail because of faulty logistics. But when you add all of those things together, faulty logistics, poor discipline, disease, and weather/environment, when you add all these things together, your business might not fail because it has poor logistics, or because it has poor process discipline, or because of viruses or malware, or because of a lack of understanding of an environment. It might not fail because of one of those, but when you add all those together, that'll kill you. You're done at that point. They say, so I'm an apiist, which is a beekeeper. I got into beekeeping. I'll give you another example of how this applies. I became a beekeeper this past year, and they said that there are 3 things that'll kill a hive: disease, starvation, and intruders like beetles, right? And the hive can deal with one of the 3. They can deal with low food. They deal with low food. They actually go and it's pretty brutal. They'll kill the males, so that only the worker bees. So they'll just cut down and say, hey, our overhead is too expensive to bring it into tech. But they'll wipe out the unnecessary. So they'll wipe out all males. They'll just brutally kill them so they can survive the winter. The next one would be sickness and illness. They can get past illness because the queen will lay more and they can work through it, and they can actually produce a hive with an illness. They'll get through it. The next is fighting off intruders, wasps, beetles. They can fight off intruders. In fact, a hive will fight off some beetles and wasps. It's pretty cool to watch them. And they have these things called undertaker bees, which will bring the beetles and the dead out of the hive to keep it clean. It's a really cool thing to see. And so a hive can deal with one of these at a time. 2 of them, your odds aren't looking good. 3 of them, and your hive's done. So you have to manage these 3. You can deal with one at a time. Just like Napoleon. He could have dealt with faulty logistics and poor discipline and disease and the weather. He could have dealt with one. In fact, he had made a military name in dealing with poor discipline. That was part of what made him great. Is that they didn't have great discipline. In fact, they weren't trained militants. They just kind of had this agile, wing it approach. But in large numbers, when he didn't focus on the other areas, it ended up being his demise. So you can deal with faulty logistics. You can deal with poor discipline. You can deal with disease and the weather. Or to bring it back to technology, you can deal with poor logistics, poor discipline, viruses, and an unknown environment. But if you have all 4, or 3 or 4 or half. You can deal with 1. Any more than that, and you decrease your rate of success. And so that's what Napoleon didn't understand. He started to get away from what he knew, and he started to just get into the brute force. That's why when he sent those 500,000 in June of 1812, after he had already had darn near a decade of military experience and poise and innovative approaches to war, he only came home with about 10,000. They made it home 6 months later, and it crippled France, and his allies started to pull out. So the example that we can understand and learn from Napoleon here is focus on your strengths. Okay? Napoleon had defeated massive armies through tactical breakdowns and reverse engineering of the battlefield. That's how he did it. He got away from that when he started to grow. Napoleon's strategies consisted of excellent maneuvering, flanking, and isolating the enemy. That's what he did previous. He got away from all of that in the Russian campaign and tried to overpower an environment, and he ran into 4 things, which you could deal with 1 of them probably, but he ran into 4. So in your own environment, you cannot deal with too many things at once. So the whole show up and see what happens plan, it didn't work for Napoleon, and it won't work for you. Make sure that you identify your 4 W's: who, what, when, and why, before you even think about automation, before you even enter into the battlefield, before you even think about showing up, before you go anywhere, before you leave your base, so to speak. Plan. Identify who, what, when, and why. Who is triggering this? Who is this for? What are we trying to accomplish? When does this happen? When does this thing happen? When does the trigger happen? When does this process happen? And why does this process happen? Why are we doing this? If you can't answer those 4 W's, then it doesn't deserve to be automated. That's just point blank simple. If you can't answer these 4 W's, then don't even think about automation. Handle it in a different way. So that is the first step in automation, guys. Focus on the 4 W's. Learn from Napoleon. Learn from his bad habits. And hopefully you got a lot out of this. I'm going to be breaking down automation, and we're going to be putting together an introduction to automation masterclass that'll go over all of these steps to automation from beginning to end. And it'll be part of our online academy masterclass courses, which is going to be launching in the new year. We'll be going. I have a DevOps introduction to DevOps course, which I've already recorded that. We have an introduction to Microsoft SharePoint, which I've already recorded. That's actually free. There's a free version of that that's actually available on our YouTube. So if you go to our youtube.com/@capitalpresence, that'll pull you up. You'll see the introduction to SharePoint. It's actually up there. I recorded a couple years ago. I'm redoing that for the updated SharePoint. That'll be online Academy as well. So we'll have introduction to DevOps, business communication masterclass. We'll have a Microsoft 365 power user masterclass up there. So we'll be releasing a lot of different trainings throughout the year. We're starting out with the 365 masterclass and the Microsoft Teams training. Those will be on Online Academy, which will be a paid subscription platform for training and masterclasses that you can subscribe to. We're going to be putting a lot of content on our YouTube at Capital Presence. So guys, check those out. And then these podcasts, we're not going to get super tactical on these podcasts, but I'm going to give you the baseline. So plan. That's a baseline, right? And the more that we get into how to plan, how to go through those 4 W's, that'll be part of the masterclass, the Introduction to Automation masterclass that'll be up on Online Academy. So hopefully you guys got a lot out of this. Thanks for listening. Make sure you like, subscribe, share this out for anybody. If you have any other businesses or friends and family who are looking to automate and they're looking to enter into the unknown, just send them this link and be like, hey guys, maybe you should listen to this podcast before you jump in. So thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening. And remember to live every day like it's Saturday. Hey there. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for all the latest videos from Capital Presence.